Here's a myth that I and you hear all the time. Addiction runs in my family, or it's in my DNA. And that sounds reasonable, right? We talk about heart disease, diabetes, even height being influenced by our genes, so why not addiction? Here's the thing. Despite decades of research and billions of dollars spent, science has never found a reliable addiction gene. Not one. What actually gets passed down is not addiction, it's the way a person behaves, their beliefs, their coping styles, and most of all, their environment. Stick with me for the next few minutes because in this episode, we're going to talk about why your DNA isn't your destiny when it comes to addiction and what really matters instead. Welcome to the Life Process Program podcast. I'm Zach Rhoads, a coach at LPP and co-author of Outgrowing Addiction with Stanton Peele. This is Ep.5 in our 15-part series, each one based on a chapter from that book, Outgrowing Addiction. The Life Process Program, LPP, offers an alternative to the disease model of addiction. Instead of saying you're powerless or doomed by your biology, we focus on building meaning, purpose, and connection, because those are the real forces that help people move beyond addiction. Back to what I was saying, your genes aren't your destiny, at least when it comes to addiction. So what do genes actually do? They're not blueprints. They don't act on their own. They're more like switches, and those switches flip on or off depending on your environment, your relationships, your experiences, even your sense of meaning. That's the science of epigenetics. Sure, you might have a disposition in the world that some will argue is inherited, like a tendency for impulsivity or openness or being prone to anxiety. But none of that automatically equals addiction. Those traits could just as easily steer you toward entrepreneurship or athletics or creativity or leadership. In other words, genes aren't weapons waiting to go off. They're variables. Here's what parents really pass down. Even if you inherit zero so-called addictive tendencies, growing up in a chaotic home with substance misuse or neglect does increase your odds of using drugs in risky ways. But that's not about chromosomes. That's about modeling. How stress is handled, how connection is built, how problems are dealt with. What gets passed down isn't addiction in the blood. It's the belief that life can't be lived without escape. And beliefs can change. The problem with the genetics story? The genetics narrative doesn't just miss the point, it hurts people. It encourages fatalism. It discourages agency. It frames addiction as a lifelong curse instead of a solvable problem. And it sets up a dangerous feedback loop. If I'm wired in this way, then what's the point in trying? As someone who lived through heroin addiction, I can tell you firsthand that's not the truth. You are not your biology. Here's the hopeful part. If trauma can be passed to the next generation, although we argue this later in the book and in a future podcast, then so can resilience. I've seen kids from families with multiple generations of substance misuse grow up to live healthy, intentional lives. And often what makes the difference isn't perfect parenting. It's just somebody out there modeling a better way to be, a coach, teacher, aunt, a mentor. You don't need perfect genes. You need to be able to access people, places, and ideas that make growth possible. So if you're worried about your DNA, don't be. Worry about your values, your relationships, and the kind of life you're building. Those are the factors that matter most, and the ones you actually control. Genes don't determine who you are, but your choices, your environment, and your support systems absolutely shape who you become. That's not just wishful thinking, that's science. Thank you for listening to the Life Process Program podcast. I'm Zach Rhoads, and this was Ep.5 of our Outgrowing Addiction series.